Hello and welcome. In this video you will see a fast-forward version of me making a DeLorean. This amazing car, old car. I think it's one of the best looking cars ever. It's utterly stupid but also amazing because it's utterly stupid and amazing for the exact same reason. There are zero compromises between design and practicality. Nothing is practical about the car. Everything is made to look cool, to look amazing, regardless how impractical it turns out to be. I had an idea of making the DeLorean from Back to the Future, but I kind of was a bit limited to how many cubes I could place to get the detail right or enough detail for that. So I ended up just making a DeLorean and trying to make it as good as I could. So what is called CPU, for those who might not be familiar with that in Robocraft, it's pretty much how many individual objects you can use. There's a lot of fast forwards in this video with slight pauses to show where I'm at in the build. The reason for this is I had about 16 hours of material while making this car, and kind of watching it all in real time would be like watch paint dry, I think. I know there's a kind of movement on YouTube with some channels having an amazing amount of views with just that, especially people working in the forest and stuff, but personally I don't enjoy it and I think that would be a bit boring. So anyway, I'm trying to get the shape done first, all the angles correct, the wheels in the correct place. I also had to kind of use the wheels as an origin point for the different measurements for the cars, because I couldn't really do anything about the wheel size. They were the size they were, and I had to base the rest of the measurements according to the size of the wheels. Might be a good time to point out that this is early alpha of Robocraft2, so if you are watching this video from somewhere in the future, there might be a variety of wheel sizes to choose from. But at the point of making this car, I only had one, and that one being very big. So the way to solve it was making the car as big as I possibly could within the space to make them fit with, or to make it fit with the wheels, to not make them look oversized for the rest of the car. I should probably point out that if you just want to see the finished result and not have to watch through all the process of making that result, the last minute of the video, something like that, is dedicated to actually showing the final build, so you could just jump ahead there. But for those who choose to stick around, thanks for staying with me. Here I start working on the doors for the car. I felt like the doors would really make or break the build, because the DeLorean has these types of doors that open up like wings towards the sides and upwards, just like a Tesla Model Y, for example, except that they had this design on the DeLorean already back in the early 1980s. So I wanted a no-gap solution. What I mean by that is I wanted the doors to close without having any gap between the door and the car itself. That provided me with some design challenges. In Robocraft2, you have these third size cubes that you can stretch out to different sizes, and the diagonal version of those small cubes only have attachment points on the top and bottom. What I did was stretch those out to different sizes to use as gap closers for the door to get this really nice even surface. It's not only how the doors open that is kind of special with this car or unique. Also the hood opens in a very different way. The motor is in the back, so there's not much luggage space there. Instead you have a small luggage space under the hood in the front. On most cars, the hood opens up towards the windshield, which is natural because it gives you easy access standing in front of the car. So it's very practical. So if that's the most practical way, is that the way the hood opens on the DeLorean? Well, of course not. It opens the other way around. So the only point of access is from the side, which is really impractical, but it looks really cool. And remember what I said in the beginning of this video, that they made zero compromises with this car? As long as it looks cool, they seem to have just gone for it, regardless how impractical, regardless how utterly stupid from industrial design perspective or user perspective. If it looks great, it's there to stay. I thought about incorporating the functionality of being able to open the hood of the car into the build, just like I do with the doors that you will be able to open. But that type of functionality in Robocraft2 uses up a lot of CPU. So in the end I decided not to go for that, because the amount of cubes I can place is fairly limited, and I was afraid I wouldn't have enough for details like the backlights and the indoors like the seats and the instrument panel later on. In this video you also see me place a lot of placeholder cubes that I later delete. That's because how you stretch the small cubes, the like third size cubes, is pretty stupid, because they kind of shift the point of where you place them as you stretch them, as opposed to the big cubes who stretch like you would guess they should stretch. But maybe if you look at this video somewhere where it's not early alpha, they might have changed this to a more logical way of stretching the small cubes. Here I opened the doors for the first time. Turns out just the right one is opening, but that was a very easy fix, because it's just that one of the hinges was trying to open the door the wrong way, and that's a setting on the hinge itself, so it just took me a few seconds once back into build mode to fix it and to get both of the doors working just as intended. So I want to get back to those small cubes and how they stretch. So I used that a ton during the build, and that also made me really annoyed with how they stretch. So if a developer happens to watch this video, first of all, thanks for watching, and thanks for watching this far in. I mean, this is pretty much like 6-7 minutes into the video, so thank you for sticking with me this far and listen to all the stuff I say. And my way of thanking you for that is by using 2 minutes of this video to complain about how a single cube is stretching, but it is what it is, right? So the way you stretch a small cube is that you end up with a middle section of a big cube, like now in the early alpha. And that means it doesn't really end up where you want it to be. So what you often have to do, like you see me do here with the back of the car for the back windshield, is that you place it on the ground, you stretch it out to the size you want, then you have to copy it and paste it in, often having to place placeholder cubes, because the attachment points for the cube you wanna place is not where you can place it. So you have to place those placeholder cubes, paste it in, remove the placeholder cubes, and that's kind of a lot of hassle, because you have to do it for each individual cube. So if they would just work like the big cubes are, where they stretch out from the point you place them, with that part of the cube staying exactly in that point, they would be so much easier to work with. The reason I used so many of those small cubes were not only because they are really great for different types of details, because, well, they're small, and I had to use them to get the nice upper part of the car with like the windshield and stuff like that looking as I wanted to, but also that stretched out they can often replace several other cubes, saving CPU. So you can kind of replace like 1.5 cubes, so to speak, with one stretched out smaller one. So I used that a lot, because like I wanted as much CPU for details as possible, so every little bit I could save without compromising the looks of the car, I did save. So that made me use the copy, paste, stretch, etc. for the small cubes over and over again during the build. So the front of the DeLorean is really nice, I think, and also one of those things that make you recognize the car, especially with that logotype in the front. It does not stand for Devil May Cry, it stands for DeLorean Motor Company. In Robocraft2 you are restricted to 6 different colors on each build. So what I did, and you can see that a lot during this build, is use different materials to get different shades of colors. So in the grill, for example, I used one material for the front of the grill and another denser material for the back, which made the back a bit darker despite using the same color for both parts. At the time of making this build, and I want to again say that this was very early alpha, so there's probably a lot more materials if you're watching this somewhere where the game is actually released. there were only 3 different types of materials. So you had a very light one, a medium one, and a heavy one. The medium and the heavy material gave different shades of the same color, so the heavy one giving a darker shade of the same color, while the light material had a texture, or have a texture, that I used for replicating fabric, or using it as fabric, so to speak, inside of the car. So a lot of times during this video, especially towards the later stages of the video or later stages of making this car, you will see me reworking a lot of stuff just to make it slightly different. And the reason for that is that I can be, so let's say there's this word that starts with an A, then there is an N, then there is the first letter one more time, and then it's an N. Now spell that word out for yourself in your head. That word, I can be that about details. So I have not actually seen one of these cars for real. They're not very common. They're actually, I think, very hard to come by. So I was looking at a lot of reference photos, and while working, I sometimes during the build discovered that I did something that wasn't really like it were on those photos, and I have a really hard time letting go of stuff like that. So if I see I should have done something a little tiny bit different, I can't just say, well, it's fine, no one will notice. Well, I noticed, so I had to redo it. So that's what I spend a lot of the time for this build on. A good example of that is actually the backlights I'm working on right now. So you can see me making backlights that have 4 rows of lights. Once I was done with those and had continued a bit working on the car, I kind of realized in the photos I was looking at and on the real car, there's only 3 rows of lights. I actually ended up redoing these backlights like from scratch. I deleted everything, I just redid them because there was 1 row too much of lights. I simply had to do it because otherwise I would be annoyed every time I looked at the back of this car. There is actually one thing though that I did end up not fixing, because I realized it too late when I was pretty much done with the car, and fixing it would have required me to start over from pretty much scratch. And that is how much the sides lean towards the roof of the car, so the roof is probably a tiny bit too narrow. So like I mentioned before, I was looking at a lot of reference photos while making this car, from the inside of the car, from the back, from the front, from the sides. And when constructing the sides and the hood and everything like that, I was looking from the front and back without thinking about that the windshield in the back and the front are not just leaning towards the roof, they're leaning from like the front, the hood, up towards, of course, the roof as well. But what that means is if someone takes a photo from the front, stuff that is further away from the photograph will look smaller than the stuff that is close, being the hood is of course closer than the roof. So on the photo, the roof will appear more narrow than in reality. So what I should have done to get those measurements correct or more like in reality would be looking at photos from above as well, and I didn't do that. But redoing or actually getting that right would require me to redo the car pretty much from scratch, like delete everything. So in the end, I decided I just had to live with it and think about that if I make another car in the future. So I want to get back to that I have not seen one of these cars in real life. It's actually not that weird because there's not very many of them. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think the main reason is that they started production of this car in 1981, and the DeLorean Motor Company that was making these cars went bankrupt in 1982 due to kind of number of factors. Partly due to production problems. Turns out a lot of those uncompromising, really cool looking stuff was kind of hard to get right in production. But also due to the fact that the founder of the company, John DeLorean, got arrested on charges of drug trafficking. So he had been recorded by US federal agents to bankroll a cocaine smuggling operation. On top of that, the British government discovered financial mismanagement with money transferred to an account in Panama that was just missing, right? It's quite a wild end to the story of the DeLorean Motor Company. So getting one today is actually rather expensive. I mean, it's a popular collector's item. There's a lot of DeLorean enthusiasts around the world. So in Europe at least, you would have to pay between 30 and 60,000 euros, with some models being a lot more expensive than that. I use a lot of small individual cubes to make details like the backlights look the way I want to. And it probably goes without saying, but this is not the way you want to use cubes, or kind of the opposite of the way you want to use cubes if you intend to use a robot for fighting other players, like you can do in Robocraft2, where that's like the main purpose of the game. The main gameplay loop is you build robots and you fight other players with the robots you build. But this is obviously not meant for that. The finished car won't even have any guns to fight with, so it's just to make something really nice looking. Another detail on this car I'm making that's not quite right compared to the real life versions of this car is this black line following the car from the back towards the front on either side. But unlike the roof that I made too narrow because I didn't think about the perspective while looking at the photos, so this line is supposed to have a slight inclination from the back towards the front, so it ends up a bit lower in the front end side of the car than in the back end. But it's a very slight inclination, and the only way I could have made that on the car inside of the game would have been to break it in several places and make it like a small stair towards the front, and I simply did not think that looked very good. So I thought it would be a lot better to just ignore that, even though the inclination would be like slightly off. The attentive person might see a small model of a blue motor in the back, standing on the floor next to the car. And if you started playing Robocraft2 somewhere after February of 2023, so you were not participating in the very early alpha stages of the game, for you this thing does not exist anymore. But very early in the development of Robocraft2, they had an engine separated from the wheels or other type of moving parts that you had to use in your builds. And I made this build of the DeLorean just before that patch where they removed that engine went live. So working on the inside of the car, I do pretty much the same as I did with the car itself. I start with like the broader, bigger stuff, and then I work out the details afterwards and refine as I see how much CPU or how much cubes I can actually spare for each individual detail. Here the front is also getting a rework, just like the back of the car. It was not in the case of the front because it looked really different from my reference photos, but more like I wanted to add some extra detail and I had to rework how the front was made to be able to add that detail. The front actually is one of the places where I use a straight post and stretch it out towards different thickness and length in order to save on CPU to a very large extent. A lot of the front is made that way. So most of the rework in the front was to be able to make the bumper in the front with those small orange lights, and also those two different kinds of gray or different shades of gray on the bumper itself, and then that little narrow line of lighter gray up towards the grille. At this point I had gotten to a stage where the car itself was pretty much done but lacked a lot of detail, so that was pretty much what I spent most of the remaining time making. For example, adding red and orange lights along the sides of the car, but also, for example, adding a few cubes on the doors to make them look smoother along the lines when they were open. So some DeLorean models have these really nice black details on the back window that I guess shade from sun and stuff like that. Well, when thinking about it, maybe not shade from the sun because you're not gonna look that way, but well, they're there and they look cool, right? So I really wanted to make them. However, the diagonal posts I made for making the back window, they don't have attachment points on the side, so there was no real place to attach those black details. And I really struggled with that, so I ended up remaking them several times before I figured out that I could use small additional black posts and stretch them out on the inside of the original ones, and thus creating some attachment points between those. But I'm really happy I figured out a way in the end, because I think it really elevated the look of the car, especially from the back and from the sides. At this time, I'm getting towards the point where I'm happy about how the car looks from the outside, even though the inside of the car is still at a very rough shape or very rough place. But remember what I said about being AN, etc. about details? There was like this place where the doors meet the front window that I was not happy with. And I tried to figure out a way to get it really smooth in the front. But I ended up with like small angles, or here you see like a little jack in the front that I was not happy with. And it took me a very long time to figure out a way to get the front window to meet the doors without any type of gap or any type of visible jack in the doors, without them actually sticking to the front window and get stuck there so you could not open it. So the way it works is that all cubes have different places where you cannot touch other cubes. So for example, a full cubes, it has every single side, so every side you can attach something. But cubes that has like a bit of an inclination, like half cubes, they don't have it on every single side. So typically the cubes that has some type of inclination don't have attachment points on the side, they lean down, and that you can use to kind of make them face each other, so you get something that looks like a full cube but can actually split in the middle. And that's the technique I use to in the end here get the doors to work the way I want to without any visible gaps. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, the DeLorean has the motor in the back, which means there's also air intakes in the back. I guess the grille in the front is just for show, it has no real purpose since you have luggage there. But in the back you need air intakes, so that's what I'm adding to add extra detail. You would actually access the motor on the DeLorean from the back by opening the trunk, so to speak. I didn't add that functionality either because it would, just like for the front, cost a lot of CPU. On top of that, I'm not even sure with the black shades on the back window if I could actually make it work. At least not in a way where it would still look as good when closed. So it was at this point I decided the outside of the car had gotten its fair share of the CPU and it was time to work on the inside of the car. And here's a small tip for you if you plan to make an artistic build or something that you do not plan to use in battle. Originally, I got this tip from a random person at the Robocraft2 Discord. And with random person, I don't mean a completely random person, I got it from a person named random person. So it makes it kind of hard to credit him, right? Anyway, what you can do is exchange weapon CPU for base CPU. Meaning, if you skip out on guns, you can use that CPU for other parts. So of course, for a robot that you're gonna fight with, that you're gonna play with as intended, that's not very smart to do because you actually want guns on the robot, right? But if you're just gonna make something that looks good, you don't need weapons. You can use the CPU for your build instead. I ended up reworking the interior several times, especially the instrument panel. For the instrument panel, I ended up with kind of a cool idea that I wanted to implement, so I ended up redoing it from scratch. I will get back to that later when I get to the point of the instrument panel. I also added some small stuff on the outside like door handles, made the floor a bit better, closing some gaps. All in all, just adding more and more detail every time I went over the car, making the wheel actually being a wheel instead of like a flat circle. Adding also, for example, a driving stick that I think looks fairly good in its original shape that I made it. But it should come to no surprise as you if you watched the video this far. I ended up reworking. The DeLorean came with both a manual gearbox and an automatic one, and I started making one with the manual gearbox. But on a manual gearbox you would have the letters or for the different gears on the top of the knob on the gear stick, and on an automatic one you would have them on the side. And I figured out a way to put them on the side using a nameplate, while on the top of the gear knob it would be too small for me to put any letters there. And I really thought it looked nice to have those letters like drive, park, etc. On the side of the gear knob, so that's why I opted for shifting for an automatic version of the gearbox. I realized it's actually first at this point that I add those air intakes for the motor I was talking about earlier at the back of the car. I used the same technique for the air filters or the air intakes for the motor as I did in the front for the grille, where I used different materials to get a certain effect or certain look. So what I do for these air intakes is that I use the medium materials for the bars, and behind that I have a plate where I use both a different color, or from start I used the same color but I later changed. So I use the gray color in combination with the light material to get kind of a filter effect, and then I use the black with the medium material for the bars. Considering this is 25 minutes into the video, if you feel like you start to get bored, this is probably a good time to jump forward and just check the final result. There's not like much left to show or explain, except maybe the instrument panel. I got really happy with how that turned out. But we're getting to that now, so after that you can safely skip forward. So the way I made the instrument panel, well, not the first one, but the one I ended up using in the end, was by using a nameplate. The nameplates in Robocraft2 are really fun to work with because they accept HTML color codes, as well as of course all the characters on your keyboard. I mean, you can use them to create some cool details, and they also accept all the colors, meaning you're not restricted to those 6 colors for the rest of the car, or for your different types of shapes and cubes that the game restricts you to. You can use the full spectrum, meaning there is actually a way to surpass those 6 colors, but only on the nameplate. And you're also allowed to stretch the nameplates to 9x9 full cubes, which is rather big, meaning you could probably use this to create some really cool effects on your car. I could think of a few ways to overlap nameplates, hide certain parts of the nameplates while using different type of characters that take up kind of a lot of space to get full parts of color to create some really amazing cool stuff. But it's not for this build. I mean, this build is a replica of a real life car, but for some other stuff it could come in really handy. So there's only like 6,000 or 7,000 of these cars in the whole world. I mean, not many were made during the short existence of the DeLorean Motor Company, and it cost as much as a new BMW or Audi. With that said, if I had unlimited money, or an amount of money where I could buy whatever I wanted, right, I would probably buy this car. I think it's real cool, really uncompromising, and looks fantastic. But I don't have unlimited money, and there's more important stuff to spend money on, like paying off the mortgage, buying food, buying clothes. So I guess I will have to be happy with just making a model of the DeLorean. Hopefully, somewhere in the future, when the game has exited alpha stage, Freon will add or increase the amount of CPU you're allowed for each single robot. And that will make it possible for me to go back to my original vision for this build and add all the stuff from the Back to the Future DeLorean, like all the buttons, all the lights, all the stuff in the back of the car. So that would be a really cool way, I think, to reuse this build in the future. And if that happens, and I make the modification on this car to make it look like the car from Back to the Future, I will put a link to a video about that car somewhere here, at least if I remember. There's a few small changes I made towards the end that I forgot to record, so if you notice that on the final build, the reason is simply I forgot to start the recording software with the final small touches of the car. One of those things being, unfortunately, the change of the gear stick from the manual one I started with to the automatic one that I think looks a lot better with a neutral, drive, etc. Printed on the side of the gear stick itself. I will make the car available on the CRF in-game, so if you play Robocraft2 and you want to check out all the details really close up on this car, you can do so. It is simply called DeLorean on the CRF, but in case I butcher the pronunciation, I will put the name of the robot on the CRF in the description of this video as well. With that said, to those who stuck with me throughout the whole 30 minutes of this video, thanks for watching. It means a lot to me, especially since I put a lot of effort into this video, a lot more than I usually do. And to those who just jumped ahead to look at the finished car, thank you to you as well. It's no shame in that, and who want to listen to me rambling for 30 minutes, right? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this build. try it out yourselves if you play Robocraft2. I'm really happy with all the details on the car. And cheers!